think we're in a global session here, so welcome to this edition of the webinar series. As already stated, we're looking at supply chain cybersecurity tonight, and I have two excellent guests. So Ian Oliver, Professor of Cybersecurity at the University of Oulu in Finland, and Paul Dorey, who is Director of CSO Confidential and also a visiting professor at Royal Holloway. And what I would like to do is just briefly set the scene in terms of EU legislation and regulation. Just as an anchor point, I know we may be a global audience, but it might be useful to everyone just to know why this is such a big thing in the EU at the moment, and then we'll open up for a more general discussion. So again, in order to set the scene, perhaps it'd be useful for me to explain to people who are dialing in that one way of looking at the EU policy and legislative framework at the moment is to think of it in three separate streams. The first and most powerful stream will be everything to do with resilience and what we call critical information infrastructure protection. The second, equally powerful stream, I would say, but totally different, is data protection. And then we have what I would call targeted policies, such as the eIDAS, such as the AI Act, such as the Cyber Resilience Act. And these tend to be actually driven by technological changes. So resilience and CIP is definitely the strongest theme, and was also the subject of the first piece of EU cybersecurity legislation, as you're probably aware, which is the NIS Directive, which came into force in 2016 and really placed a framework around everything we are doing in critical infrastructure since then. This is actually quite interesting in that the origin of the CIP approach can be traced back to around 2009, when the Commission published a communication called Protecting Europe from Large-Scale Cyber Attacks and Disruptions, Enhancing Preparedness, Security and Resilience. If you haven't heard of this paper, I would really recommend you go and have a look at it. It's very short. It's only about 6 or 7 pages, and it really contains all the roots of the modern day EU approach to resilience. You can trace the initial instruments right through to today, and it's very enlightening how this happened. And this, of course, was in turn a consequence of the cyber attack on Estonia in 2007, which sort of woke up the world and got us all thinking about this kind of thing. So moving on, ENISA published its first paper. So ENISA, for those of you who don't know the organization, is the EU Cybersecurity Agency. It published its first paper on supply chain security in 2015, but I think, to be quite honest, it went largely unnoticed, and the issue was unfortunately not covered by the NIS Directive. The paper did, however, make some sensible recommendations, the development of a supply chain integrity framework and a legislative proposal for dealing with the issue, amongst other things. So we took some time to think about it, but we got there in the end. This led to the NIS2 directive, which is the successor to the NIS directive, and this came into force in January 2023. And this does set out requirements on supply chain issues. So, in my opinion, at least, NIS2 is likely to be the key EU instrument dictating the approach to supply chain security, although the CRA also makes some interesting statements about supply chain security. Here, it's interesting to note that Article 21 states that affected entities will have to put in place appropriate and proportional technical, operational, and organizational measures to ensure supply chain security. Note two things here. The word proportional, which is also used in a companion piece of legislation called DORA, which is for the banking sector and has very similar aims. And it says, you don't have to bleed yourself dry to do this. It should be proportional to your means and to your risk. And it's also not prescriptive. So it leaves the choice of mechanisms open to the implementers, which I think is a very good thing. And Article 22 describes an EU-level supply chain risk assessment process known as coordinated risk assessment, which basically allows the EU as a whole to look at, for instance, the sector and say, hey, we're not too happy with this. We're going to put some new requirements in place. So it's a sort of catch-all that enables the legislation to develop as needed. In 2023, ENISA published a follow-up paper on supply chain security. All the ENISA deliverables are free, by the way. You can find them on the website. This one is called Good Practices in Supply Chain Security. And at the same time, the agency noted that the supply chain compromises software dependencies, was the #1 emerging cybersecurity threat in the time frame for 2030. So this is telling us, that the whole area has gone up in importance since that initial paper in 2015, and we see this in other areas too. So, but from this paper, from an issue in 2023, which surveyed a number of organizations, there's some interesting things came out, which might not surprise you, but even so, they're worth stating. First of all, 86% of the surveyed organizations had supply chain policies in place. That's good. However, only 47% allocated budget to the issue. And I would say even more telling is the fact that 76% do not have dedicated roles and responsibilities for supply chain security. So my personal opinion on this, what this is saying is that people have gone through the policy step, but the maturity of implementation is very low. And we have quite some catching up to do, I think, in order to be compliant with what the CRA will ask us to do. Now, talking about the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, which is all about secure products and providing information about secure products to customers throughout Europe, there are also provisions related to supply chain security. It's addressed in several recitals. That's the bit you find at the start of the regulation or directive, which explains a bit the context of what the EU is trying to do. And then Article 6 states that the Commission can adopt delegated acts specifying categories of products which will require manufacturers to obtain a European cybersecurity certificate based on supply chain considerations. In other words, certification against supply chain requirements may well become obligatory. Interestingly, also, the CRA also references a thing called the Software Bill of Materials, the SBOM, which many of you are aware of in Recital 37 and in Article 10. Interesting to note that the SBOM is required by the US Executive Order on Cybersecurity of 2021. So it's a tested instrument. Probably we'll have more to say on this later. Personally, I think it's a very good thing, depending on, of course, on how you implement it. So I have a number of recommendations that maybe later on I'll get the chance to give you as takeaways, as it were. But before I do that, I think I'd really like to pass on to my colleagues and hear their point of view. So maybe I will start with, let me think. Let's do it alphabetically. I'll start with Paul and ask, please, if you can spend 5 minutes and give us your views on key challenges and opportunities in this area.
Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. So I work predominantly in sectors like financial services, aviation, and also energy. And it's pretty fair to say that every organization has a critical dependency on supply chain, even if it's only Google or Microsoft. Without the supply, you can't operate. I see 3 challenges that I'd like to cover. The first one is the asymmetrical relationship that you have in the supply chain. So the supplier knows far more about the service that they offer and the product that they produce than the consumer of that service and the user of that product. And I'm talking about businesses as consumers and users here. And so that's the first asymmetry. But the next asymmetry is about risk. And in terms of the impact that a cyber problem could have, through that service, that depends on the operation that it's being used to support. And so the energy company, the bank, etc., will know the impacts that could be caused. And the supplier may not even have thought about that sector when they were devising their service or their product. So there's a sort of gap between the sort of risk picture, which is interesting if it's supposed to be appropriate and proportionate to risk if they didn't know what they were doing at the time they were building it. In terms of what appropriate and proportionate would be. They might have said, why are you doing anything that critical with something we didn't ever think of it being used in that way? I think that risk context is really important. The second challenge, I think, is around information sharing. Whereas there's information that's inherently sensitive in a cybersecurity context, whether it be, I've had an incident, how much can I really share that with you without it ending up in the media when I'm really trying to work through it? I have vulnerabilities. I'm prepared to share that with you, but I want to make sure I have the chance of fixing them before before somebody would come and exploit it. And then the whole complexity of sharing security state. You know, if you think about the scale of an information security management system, how do you sensibly share that in a way that someone can get some sense of what the real security management outcome would be? So that's the second challenge. I think that the third challenge comes in to your point, Steve, which is when you actually try and do something about your policy, you then move into assurance, which is how do I measure and assess what I'm really getting from my supplier? And I think we see that processes can create entire industries of questionnaires, of teams writing them, of teams reading them, of teams responding to them. I know organizations that have hundreds of people dedicated to just supply chain assurance, either receiving questionnaires or transmitting the same. So how do we get through that? What you normally do is you go to a level of abstraction instead. So you might say, are you certified? And I know to hear that. But once again, that certification was probably done when the risk that you were managing wasn't really known. So most people certify the company, not the service. And so how do you get to the real risks that underlie it? Those to me are the sort of key themes. I think that there's an opportunity, by the way, which I'll just throw in at the end, which is we have a skills shortage in cyber. And so if we better used our expertise either side of that relationship, so that if a supplier solved it once for a sector, then that's the sector sorted, rather than every single entity having to do their own thing. But that proves to be very difficult. I'm sure we'll explore that.
Thank you, Paul. Good timing. Ian, why don't you let us have your point of view? Do you agree? Have you got different points?
Well, okay. I've been scribbling down some notes here as I do. I've actually come into this from a much more technical background. I actually spent probably about 10, 15 years of my career actually trying to build these kinds of systems. And in fact, even 10 years ago, we were jumping up and down within the industry I was working on, which was telecommunications, saying, look, we need to know where all this stuff is coming from and how do we communicate that to the customer. But it was not seen as an important thing that we should tell the customer. I mean, a lot of industries like aerospace, telco, a lot of the critical industries are actually quite closed anyway. So releasing this kind of security information or admitting that you are actually using components that may have come from a dubious source or may not be strictly up to date could lead to compromises around that. One of the things, a couple of things I put down here, we're actually missing attestation mechanisms. Both at a very deep technical level. The software doesn't exist as such, or it does, but it's very limited. We have the hardware around that, good old TPM and so on. But even if I give you an SBOM today, it's just a bunch of data. What do I do with it? And often you're in a situation where, okay, now I've got this information, I can't do anything with it, but I can tick off that compliance box. I mean, this goes back to the asymmetry that Paul talked about. And interestingly, this comes up in a lot of industries, and you can even go back to the Nobel Prize paper called On Lemons by Akerlof, who talked about how used cars are being sold. It's the same kind of idea. So there's a lot of issues around what do I do with this stuff now I've even got it, and so on. But yeah, I will agree that there's a very, very big danger that instead of doing something about this, and I worked a lot in privacy, so I'm going to upset a lot of lawyers here. We end up doing a lot of process. We solve things with process. Yes, another process, so great. And then we write compliance statements. Here's a certificate, etc. Or we say things to customers such as, your privacy or supply chain is important to us, as if that actually changes things. And what we're not thinking about here is actually how we implement this stuff. How do we actually deal with it? What's the engineering side of it? And so on. So they're the things that actually worry me, really. And then just to finalize off, I mean, yes, if we have certificates and certification and so on, that's all very good. We had a situation here in Finland where one company had a very, very major data breach. I think it was the CEO came out and said, but we were certified. as if that actually meant something. So maybe that's what we should do. When you hack into a system, the first thing it says is, this is ISO 9000 certified, go away, done. And that's the state that I fear we're going to end up in. I see you laughing there, Steve. I'm afraid it's, yeah.
No, look, I'm 100% in agreement with you. I spend a lot of time talking about this and about this very point. So to be quite clear, I have a lot of problems with the way certification works across the industry. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It can be a very good thing, but I think it's totally misunderstood. People read far too much into it. And, certification can easily be rubbish in, rubbish out if you don't think about what you're doing. So, but let me share something with you equally general, but which I think is also a problem within the supply chain security issue. It sort of leads on from the same subject as certification. Over the years, and talking with many people, I find that people focus very quickly on the things that are easy to do and then bring them some sense of relief that they've done something. So writing policies is one of them. Other things, maybe acquiring tools, etc. But it is my feeling that people don't really seek to understand the problem to the extent they should do. So I think it's an industry where people launch very quickly into solutions, between brackets. But half the time they're getting solutions on board before knowing really what the problem is they're trying to solve. And then there's a lot of copying from competitors. Do you think this is happening in supply chain security? It seems to me you both have similar concerns. And if so, what do we do about it?
Okay, so first of all, on the process side, we've got too many standards rather than too few. You can pick anything you want out of the list. But to make it more real, I think we are seeing some genuine attempts at testing. So there are service providers who will give you a sort of sense test of at least what the internet presence of the supplier looks like. Now, you could argue that may not be a very good representation of the product that they're producing, but if they have a weak attitude to the way they show up on the internet, with poor email security or sort of weak websites or whatever. But I think it is a piece of data that is quite useful. So I tried to explain to one of my students and said that if someone's got an untidy garden, does it tell you anything about how messy their house is? And it probably does, actually, in a way. So certainly if they've got a tidy garden, they may have a very, they might have a tidy house. So it's a rather silly analogy, but I think it makes the point of what can you test and see that at least gives you some insights, because absolute certainty on certain things is not possible even inside a corporation, let alone outside.
No, I like this. I mean, testing is something that's pragmatic. It's really doing something. It's aiming to understand the problem in more detail. And this is really, I think, where when I've been in discussions like this in the past, this is where we start to get a bit short on information. So, if I were to be in industry now trying to put in place an approach to supply chain, I must admit, I would find it rather daunting, I think. For one thing, there's probably hundreds of suppliers, at least in big organizations. So it seems to me you've got to somehow prioritize them. You probably need to come up with an approach, which is realistic. So you've got to think about the depth of the supply chain you're going to analyze. I mean, probably you don't want to go 10 levels down because you will never finish. So I'm sort of interested to know if you've come across, you mentioned testing. I think this is a good start. But how about this initial problem of deciding how you're going to sort of grab the thing by the horns and deal with it? Again, my gut feeling tells me I would probably try to list the suppliers, categorize them, prioritize them, and limit the depth to which I went in the supply chain. But, I don't have to do this, and it's a very naive approach, maybe. What do you guys think? Or are there better approaches?
Yeah, I actually think there are probably some very good learnings from existing safety critical industries, aviation being the classic example.
Yeah.
I mean, their supply chain, the knowledge that they have in the supply chain and the way they look at things, is very, very different to the way we do things in software. And actually, that's also been the base for how, for example, some of the work on privacy and risk management has gone. And maybe there are some very good learnings there. So, for example, if you do have an aircraft, yes, for any part within that aircraft, any physical component, it's probably a lot easier with physical components as well, is you can get a document that says how this was made, what the material is, and more critically, what all the kind of failures that you can expect from this. So, okay, maybe they're driven a lot more by failure or fear of failure than we are. Maybe we don't kill enough people in software, which is a brutal way of putting it, but that really got aviation the way it was. The other thing I see that we're missing, so if I'm asked today, okay, how do we go and evaluate or audit this supplier? I don't really have the criteria for it. And even if I do have the criteria, there is a very big danger that it becomes a checkbox exercise, not a checklist exercise, as you might see in the safety critical domain, where if I don't have some information, it's not a statement that this thing is wrong, but rather, this is now an additional risk I've got to take into consideration. I believe there's a lot of work by James Reason, University of Birmingham, I believe, on this work. So yeah, it's also, we're also seeing the shift from compliance to risk management and so on. I think there's a good analogy in the privacy sector around this now that GDPR has come in and so on.
Okay.
But I have particular views on that.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me, and it sort of ties into what Paul was saying. So, Paul, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, sorry, I'm just going to pick up on that because in the work that I've been doing in the UK supply chain expert group within NCSC, is that aviation is being seen as a very good model to follow and to adopt. And what the aviation model does, it generates transparency and conversation and communication. And so they're approaching the same towards, say, a cyber specification as well, which is clarity about what we want. In other words, this thing must be able to cope with the following situations. The following badnesses need to be managed and end up with good outcomes. The supplier responds with, right, this is how we're going to deal with that. If necessary, the regulator then picks it up and says, yeah, that sounds like a good answer to the question that's being posed, and then this flow goes backwards and forwards between supply, and then user and adopter, integrator, etc. Whereas it seems to me that in other sectors, it's much more, I create a list, I throw it over the wall, you fill it in, you throw it back. We didn't really understand what we were talking about when we were ticking the box. Whereas that's not what aviation was about at all. It was very much about common understanding.
Right, and I think this is an excellent point. And in fact, I was going to sort of throw the ball back to you with exactly this point. When you started off your views on the subject, you mentioned this idea of asymmetry, which was actually a very good one, I think. And I think it's really one of the biggest obstacles which we have to get over. So the process you've just described, to some extent, is taking care of this asymmetry because it's passing information across in a more fluid manner. But so I think this is good, and I can understand that aviation is a good model, but wouldn't you say that aviation by necessity is a rather slow-moving industry because it's got such high safety concerns, whereas software moves, sort of warp speed to the Star Trek is obvious. And my feeling is some of the instruments that we're coming out with nowadays, take certification, for instance, they seem to be rather slow given what we expect of them.
Well, I mean, that's a really damn good point. So many years ago when I started working in privacy, we saw the same thing. We saw, we have to do legal compliance, which is very, very slow moving. And we actually brought in a lot of techniques from aviation on how to do checklists and how to talk with the engineers and what they should check in their products. What we noticed was aviation works the way it does is because its processes are fixed. Aircraft have to take off. Once you've taken off, you have to fly, and then you have to land. You can't skip any of those processes. The practitioners in that field are very, very well trained in that one job of flying that aircraft safely. And they've also got mechanisms if something goes wrong, or if a pilot says, right, I'm not going to do that, and doesn't fly, there's no comeback on him. It's treated as a safety issue and investigated in I guess, a no blame way. What we found was, at least in software engineering, it's much, much more chaotic, and those strict processes don't work. So we found ourselves having to simplify a lot. And in fact, there's a very good piece of work by an American surgeon called Atul Gawande on how they applied aviation principles in the surgical domain. And we saw exactly the same things happening in the software domain. I think you see the same kinds of structures here. Aviation is very slow moving. We're very, very fast moving. So things need to be much more simplified. And I think we need to concentrate much more on not the process of supply chain and how we do that, but rather what we need at each stage. What's the essential thing that we need at each stage?
Very good.
Yep.
Okay, so Paul, I mean, you like myself, you've been in the industry a long while. We typically talk of people, process, technology, and we always emphasize, as I think Ian has just done in some ways, you know, the needs to have these things working in harmony with each other. What's your take on this in our industry? Have we got it right? Have we got a long way to go? And if it isn't right, what do you suggest to help remedy this, given what that Ian has just said?
Right. So when it comes down to the people, process, and technology, we haven't talked much about the people. I think that's the secret to flexibility and speed, which is if you get people aligned so that they know how to work together, they understand what the mutual goals are, there's sufficient trust for those goals to be aligned and mutual rather than, I mean, the problem of the contracts approach to supply chains, it does tend to make it a bit negotiated, adversarial. Whereas when it comes to security, it should be the right answer because bad security is bad for everybody.
Yeah.
So I think it's that we need to break through. And what we're seeing is some sectors are starting to create sector dialogues where their supply chain work out how they're going to interact with the sector, and their benefit is that if they get it right, they get it right with the many customers rather than having to have all these bilateral conversations going on. So I think it's down to mutual trust and the willingness to work together.
Very good. So look, I think we've almost come up with a sort of set of conditions that need to be created before you stand any chance of success. Let me play it back to you. I mean, I think from listening to both of you, we think that the client needs to have a clear understanding of their needs, because how can someone in the supply chain help them if they don't? It would just be a hopeless task. And of course, this is complicated by what you pointed out, Paul, that quite often with commercial off-the-shelf solutions, the thing is designed before it's even presented to the environment. So that's a really big problem. I agree with you. But we also need to have, Ian's point is we need to have a sort of stable process environment. Otherwise, again, things will be changing on a daily basis and we'll have to adapt our approach to it in order to take care of that. So these are the starting conditions. And I do agree. I think these are pretty necessary, even though I'm a bit skeptical that we will always be able to get them in our industry, but we can at least try our best, as it were. Now, let's say we start from this point of view. What do you think are the prevalent standards, methodologies, and techniques that people should consider? And it can be very practical stuff, even best practices. Yeah, let's not get hung up on formal things. What would you recommend people take a look at when they're taking the first steps in putting something in place from a practical point of view? I'll kick you off. Well, so go ahead.
Okay. How practical do you want to go here? I mean,
very practical.
Very practical. Okay. Very simply. I mean, if you're shipping a piece of hardware, or let's start with hardware because it works. The same principle applies. When the customer gets that piece of hardware or software or component container, whatever you want to call it, they want to know it's come from you.
Yeah.
That's all. It needs to have some kind of identity. Maybe not authenticate. It needs an identity. We need to be able to reference that. And if we can't reference it, then there's no point in having any software bill of materials or any bill of materials, because you need something to reference to. There's also the question that how available should this be? We can talk about authentication mechanisms and so on, but they should also be available, which also triggers another interesting issue. And I go slightly off here. It is often seen by some manufacturers that they don't need to do this because they've never seen a problem and no customer has ever reported to them a problem. And because nothing has happened or they've never seen anything bad has happened, even if they're not looking, often they're not even looking for the problems, they don't see a reason for this. So it's quite multifaceted, but I'd start off saying you need identities of things, and whether they're kind of virtual or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Whether it's down in a piece of hardware, you need identities, and once you have that, then you can start linking them together to give you a much better idea of what kind of system that you're dealing with.
No, I like this idea. So it's almost a proof of origin. I was wrong in suggesting authenticate. I think it's more proof of origin and
Provenance is the word, isn't it?
provenance. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
I think obviously I can understand it. Let's try and link it back to this famous S-bomb. I'm quite upbeat about the S-bomb. I mean, and you say you don't know what to do with that. I can understand that, but it would seem to me, at least let us presume that we have solved this proof of origin problem. We could at least say, yes, we want it, or no, we don't want it. And that's a start. One of the problems, just to throw something into the mix, which we're all aware of and which is very common to our industry, very problematic, is we know that developers are going fishing, bits of code off websites all over the internet because it's efficient, enables them to meet their dialogue. But of course, half the time they have no idea what they're mixing into their own code. So we need some kind of mechanism to get a hold of this. And the S-bomb might do it in the sense is you're not likely to detect it, but should someone add the fact that this software originated with them, there's an accountability behind it, presumably in the future. And this might be an interesting thing. But Paul, I'd like your comments on this because I know that you're quite up to date on the S-bomb and you've looked at it a lot.
Yeah. So, first of all, the first time I was exposed to a big technology vendor showing me what an S-bomb would look like, was actually did it graphically, which was probably the best thing. It looked like a sort of a galaxy of just all these exploding things interconnected. And then they said, there you go. If I was to give you that, what would you do with it? And of course, I know no organization apart from, well, very, very, very few that can actually consume that if they were given it.
And this is Ian's point. And
So I think that, however, logically, it's the right thing to do is to know what you've got. And it might be an eye opener to the vendor to realize what they've got as well sometimes when the developers have been pulling in things from libraries, etc. So I think that there's a curation exercise that can be laid on top where someone could say, you know what, if you tend to use those libraries, you're going to end up with worse code than if you use these other libraries.
Yeah.
And these are things that, that academics have been looking at and coming up with a certain amounts of provenance and sense of health of things. And is it perfection? No, it's not. But it's better to know that. And as a risk manager, if I tell you that that you're walking on sort of unsafe ground versus safe ground, that's okay. That's a useful piece of information. I don't know what Ian thinks about that.
I actually agree with you. I think it's better to have that than not to have it. And something that's been missing from this discussion is the customer, the poor person at the end of the day who gets this. One argument that was given to me is the customers don't understand it. Okay, that's correct. They don't have the tools. We do not have the infrastructures for doing this. But me as a customer, if I get an S-bomb or H-bomb or any bill of materials from a vendor, I'm going to get that feeling that these guys take it much more seriously. It's a selling point, if you like. So regardless of not whether you can use it at this stage, being able to generate it and give it to your customer and say, look, it's almost stating that we're taking this seriously, and we want you to trust us. I mean, there's that word coming up again, always comes up, trust. Just giving it to the customer now, even without the tooling, is going to give some assurance. It means something to the customer. Then they're going to start asking for, well, how do I deal with this, and so on. But very, very, very little steps.
No, I like that, and I like the fact you introduced trust because at the end of the day, it's a big factor in the whole thing. Yeah, I mean, it's all about trust at the end of the day. Look, when I was thinking about S-bomb myself, and I haven't seen any examples, my fear was that it might end up a bit like we saw for a while in the data protection area, where you generate reams and reams of papers, and of course it's a chain, so they all attach to each other in large chains of reams of papers, and you end up with something very voluminous. So I was thinking maybe you need a sort of declarative language, which is very simple, which you can say the most basic things. To keep the document short, and then to come back to this idea, you probably do need some kind of cryptographic signing behind it so that you can get accountability. Does this seem a way to go, or do you think that's over complex and we should indeed rely more on trust? I do take the point that if you go to the effort to producing one, it's a signal in itself, for instance, right?
So
Yeah.
I like the completeness approach, and I do think, and I still fall on what I said, that if I was writing software in a company, I would want to have that, because I need to know what's in what I'm producing. I mean, it's a madness not to. However, if you come to then assuring that, I think there are some much simpler tools that actually take you some of the way there. So if we look at the ETSI standards for IoT, okay, they're not they're far from the most software scientific, but to say things like don't embed passwords in code, at least have a password that they can, and the very few things that are produced in. So for those who sort of want to look it up, it's the EN 303645 standard, which has just come out, version 3. You can look it up, 3.1.3, and that's just a simple way of saying if you've got an IoT device, it should at least meet this limited set of criteria, and it's only just into double figures.
Right. I like the fact that we broadened out, because at some stage, indeed, I was going to bring this in. I mean, we're now into the era, I think, of secure software coding cycles, which I think is a very important component here. And you yourself mentioned coding standards, which I think are enormously valuable. I remember at the time there was a non-profit organization called SafeCode, for instance, that was promoting this, which I thought actually did a very good job.
They still have that; they're still publishing. So
there you go. So I mean, I think this ties in with what Ian was saying about the element of trust. If you know that an organization is making efforts to keep its software understandable and it's following a certain set of guidelines like this, and particularly if they can prove it, of course, I think then this is a big step in the right direction. But let me add another level of complexity into it. How do you think OT affects all this? Have you come across any supply chain with OT in there by any chance? You have. That's very good. Well,
yeah,
I said Ian, of course, mentioned it already with aviation technology. So
yeah. Well, actually, on the software side, I mean, I was involved in building some of this stuff as part of my research, and still do. But so we do have tools out there. SigStore is probably the canonical one for container technologies. And being able to have a naturally distributed database, let's call it that, where I can go get the digital signatures or signed hashes at least of containers that I'm downloading. So when I actually pull these into my repositories, I actually do have a record. I can trace it back to a supplier. That gives me some assurance, and that's something that can be done very easily, and it's trivially automatable. You can attach the SBOM to that, and then you can build up your tooling after that. So there are tools existing on the OT side of things. Whether we're using them is another thing, but we need to start somewhere. The data has to be there.
No, I agree. I mean, and I like the fact that this discussion is now very practical. So how do you really go about doing this? One of the things perhaps that worries me is that I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're in a time slot where there are lots of standards out there, but you have to choose a set, and other people may choose different sets. It's the old thing, which set of standards do you choose? I don't know if you see any convergence here, either in standards or techniques or tools. Because I think sooner or later there is a danger that we will all sort of converge on different ways of doing things, and then we'll have the usual problem of trying to compare with each other, which will be horrific. So, do you see?
If I was to ask one of the engineers in energy what to look at, or in fact any of the process plant systems, they would say the IEC 62443 standard.
Right.
Which came out of an engineering background. It came out of the ISA, ISA 99, and actually had immediately attempted to certify against it, which was interesting, and created something called ISA Cert. But sadly, if you go and look at how many products and systems have been through it, it's not very many. But I think relative to 2002, when we had nothing. Or very rudimentary in first cut of ISA 99. I think that particular IC standard sets come a long way, and they have 6-1, which is the supply chain assurance. But again, it's quite processy. Well, worth noting though, it talks about capability level and maturity levels in it. So that's the attempt at saying, I made this ready for this type of security level of issue. And therefore, you can then say whether you should be adopting it for your purpose. So at least that's an attempt at breaking down that asymmetry. At least there's some sort of scoring system in there. Are lots of people using it? Not as many as I'd like, but it's probably the winning one I see. I don't know if Ian sees any others.
From the telco domain, which was my area for many, many years, yeah, there's stuff in IETF, ETSI, etc. Specifically targeting supply chain, there are moves towards this. But if you were to challenge me right now and say, okay, which standard should we apply for this class of systems, I'd have to put my hands up and say, I have no idea. And there is work in IETF, quite a lot of work on attestation going on, which is really, really good. We got the TCG for things like TPM. But I mean, on a practical day-to-day level for the engineers, we really just don't have much.
No, I sort of tend to agree. And my own thinking on this is that probably it would make sense to go down the sectorial route. That is, I suspect that certain standards, for instance, in the electricity business, will differ quite a lot from standards that you would use in a bank or indeed in a hospital. So I suspect that we may end up with parallel existence of these standards, but of course we don't want too many. Otherwise, as I say, we won't be able to benefit from cross-industry experience, and the whole taxonomy of the thing will be messed up, etc.
Yeah. On the other hand, I do see some very nice things coming in now. So I mean, if you're using GitHub or GitLab, there are, for example, SPDX plugins. So there's almost no excuse that if you're developing a piece of software, there are plugins that will generate US bombs. And having that kind of automation available for you is going to be a big thing. Once we've got to I think a reasonably mature and accepted state of that, with I can go to I can download a container and somebody says, okay, this is where you get the SPDX file or wherever. Then I think we're in a better state where the standards actually then start to become understandable or more relevant.
Right. Okay. Look, so that was interesting. Pretty much went where I expected it to go. So I think we've got some work to do here. And by the way, I think I explained that there is an article within the Cyber Resilient Act which gives the Commission the right to start asking for certification against supply chain. And of course, if you're going to certify something, you've got to have a governing standard. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out. Okay, let me put you on the spot a little bit, but I think I prepared you for it. It would be nice to ask each of you to give what would you think is the most fundamental advice that you could give to a company starting out today that has got its policy there but needs to start implementing a supply chain approach? What's the biggest thing that you would advise them to do?
Shall I chip in? Right. So it starts with a supplier review. So it's what do we use? What are our dependencies? What are our software trees? What are our service dependencies? Let's play that against criticality. Let's put them into a top list,
right?
And then start working through that. Obviously, I would then say then form relationships with those that are the most important to you. Assuming that you're able to develop, have that sort of influence. Not all organizations can, but if you don't know what you're using, that's the first thing. The people who have never done it will discover many more suppliers than they ever thought they had. And then the next thing is, right, let's flush them out and start talking to the most critical.
And before moving over to Ian, would I be correct in saying that probably, I mean, do disagree, but given there are many suppliers, probably best to concentrate on first-tier suppliers and not to worry too much who's behind them in the chain in the first step, because you need to go through the prioritization.
You have to start with that. Although interestingly enough, certainly the next level, people then start to say, oh my goodness, we've got a security vulnerability. And that then causes you to drill down deeper than you ever thought you would, because you didn't know that you had a log4j exposure until you asked your suppliers and you found out where these things really were. So I think practically, in the perfect world, you do exactly what I said, which you start with the list, and then like any battle, the plan changes with engagement. And as soon as you get something like one of those vulnerabilities, then you find yourself doing rather more.
Right. Good point. Yeah.
I come from the exact opposite point of view. I say, let's not be prescriptive. If you're a software hardware company, just produce a bill of materials and give it to your customers. Very simple ones. So, for example, if you're shipping hardware and they have a TPM, give them the endorsement key, give them the PCR values, and say, this is how it was when we shipped it to you. And by the way, if they don't, here's how to check. And if they don't match, this must have happened. Same with if you're shipping a piece of software, generate the software bill of materials, SPDX format, and just give it to the customer along with that and say, okay, this is what we produced. There are some tools out there that you can go and read and let it develop in a much more organic way. So you preempt the customer and you already start that conversation. And I think that's worked really well for some of the customers I've worked with.
No, I can understand that. It's interesting. I'd come up with the same approach as Paul, was understand the problem and identify your important suppliers. But I can see exactly how going from the bottom, but maybe you do both, in fact.
Well, I think you do both. And what you've just seen here is actually a supplier-customer conversation, right? So I came at it from the consumer of service or software product, and Ian's come at it from the supplier of that. And so I think if those two approaches worked, it'd be fantastic, because you'd receive a nice bundle of SBOMs and you go through the ones that were for your most critical suppliers.
Excellent. Yeah, I really like that. It's true. So without any prompt, we got to the heart of the problem, as it were. I don't know. Do we have any questions from the listeners at the moment?
There was one quick question, I think, Steve. Can you see it in the Q&A?
I'm sorry, I'm not. Let me just have.
I can read it if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. What are the risks of automated software updates, particularly after the CrowdStrike outage?
Ooh. Very good. I think that's an excellent point. Well, I'll let you guys kick off.
Go on, Ian. That's your space, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of this can be traced back to almost very, very poor testing, and actually not understanding the complexity of environments that this software is being deployed into. I mean, okay, the biggest risk, everything just goes to hell. The whole system comes down. At best, it works just, and you don't get any errors. The problem that we often have here is that we've actually forgotten to take a systems view on things. So if I go and update some software, I'm applying a patch to a much, much larger system with a lot of probably unknown interconnections and intricate dependencies. So, that's something that maybe SBOMs can help us with. If you update this, by the way, here is the component that might cause you trouble. So
yeah, I would say when you talk about testing, I mean, there are at least two sides to it, aren't there? There's the testing that the supplier does in their own environment, in which you can take all the commercial off-the-shelf software and make sure it works, which in this case wasn't done, obviously. And then there's the customer testing, where you have to, as you say, test it in your own environment, where you've got goodness knows what else working at the same time.
And Steve, I think to that point, what hopefully this has taught anyone receiving patches as a customer of a particular supplier is make sure you phase things, make sure that you don't big bang stuff.
Yes.
Start somewhere small and quiet. Now, okay, if it's a 0 day, you do have another clock that's ticking potentially, particularly if it becomes one that's live in the environment. But still, the idea that people were rather over trusting that these automated processes would give them a good result. Perhaps that one lesson has taught us something.
Yeah,
I would add another dimension to this, if I may. So I think you've got the whole bit about testing, and I fully agree with what you guys say. I think it's really important to get this right, to think out the level of risk involved, etc. But you know, the other side of the coin is what really amazed me personally is it's obvious that a lot of big players did not have a suitable business continuity plan in place. So something happened and they were completely surprised. And these are big players, right? So, you know, this is even more alarming in a sense that, you know, I would have thought you have ways of backing out of a change. In this case, it was rather difficult, but, you know, you have spare systems that you can roll over to, you know, all the normal stuff that you would put into a business continuity plan. So this seems to also have been rather absent.
Yeah, I think the issue there is the business continuity plan was written and it was on, you know, a nice document. It's saved on disk somewhere, and then, hey, we're compliant. We have a business continuity plan.
I think
Right.
it may have also assumed that they had a network, and the only network that worked in this situation was the network with what they used to call sneaker net, of somebody actually walking around from system to system physically having to do an install. And that's a big deal nowadays when we've assumed with distributed systems. So, you know, that used to work in the office. Post-pandemic, does it mean driving around to everybody's house and having to do it?
Actually, that's an excellent point, Paul. And I would like, perhaps, because we're coming towards the end, I'm afraid we haven't got too long left, but putting this in a more general context, you both said it at one point or another, and it's a very strong belief of myself that you know, we are perhaps too oriented towards papers and procedures and formalities, whereas it's practical things which save you in everyday life. So what really worries me is when I hear people describing procedures that are sort of 34 pages long, they're not updated, people can't even find them in a disaster, etc. So my feeling is, to bring the debate up a bit, it's nice to see emphasis on supply chain security and that people are taking it seriously. But I hope it doesn't go down this path, and I hope it goes down a very practical path where we require a minimum of formalism, and that formalism really gives you something. And a lot of, you know, this sort of, I would even call it prototyping and testing and learning what works and communicating with each other, as you both stressed, in order to make sure that when something happens, even if it's not, you know, it doesn't look as fine as it should on paper, it will save the day. Don't know if you sort of agree with that, if you're similar fears, or do you think we are getting the balance right in terms of, I mean, one of you mentioned certification. Personally, I think we rely too much on certification, and half the time I'm not sure people even understand what it means.
But that's true. I think the thing I bring to this, and as I said before, if you're a supplier, just start. There are tools for doing this. Just start using them. Just produce it, give it to your customer, and let it build up very, very naturally. You know, and of course, as Paul said earlier, you can come from the other side as well at the same time. But we still have to find this happy medium. We still have to figure out how this is going to work, which I don't think will happen if we start coming in with demanding the certification, etc., and
No, exactly.
compliance.
I think this is,
Yeah.
And I think, to be fair, that will be, you know, very much a second step. So,
Yeah.
but look, here's another idea, because having had done a piece of work with Paul in the past, I know, Paul, you're working with communities, and I think the idea of user groups and specialized groups, maybe on a sectorial basis, maybe wider, to discuss and to try and come up with common approaches to this is a good idea. So maybe you can describe what you've been through there and whether you think it's a good idea for other people to get involved in this kind of thing.
Yeah, so when I'll use the an energy sector example in the UK. So when faced with generating this pile of paperwork that was both painful to create and painful to respond to and then painful to review, the idea was to say, could we have a dialogue with the main suppliers in the electricity and gas supply chain in the UK to say what would work collectively for us? You know, what things could we agree mutually to achieve? And through that dialogue, actually produce a code of practice and partnership, that last P put at the end of code of practice, and actually, you know, come up with something where it was less to do with perhaps documents, but more to do again with relationships.
Right.
And the latest thing that we're moving to, which plays to your last question about reality, is to run exercises involving the suppliers as well as the customers.
Right.
And so that's the point you learn that, hey, hang on a bit. If that's the scenario, I don't think we can help you in the way that you hoped we would.
And Ian, this is perhaps also a good opportunity for the academic sector in the sense that I think these groups are going to appreciate having input from people who are researching into new techniques, etc. So do you see this as the university is playing an important role in these kind of groups to discuss practical implementations of supply chain security?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the universities are the place where you can do the testing, the experimenting in a very low risk environment. It is a place where companies can come in and say, look, can you build us this? They can get something relatively quickly with a lot of very deep knowledge, which the companies might not have behind, and get something to test out. So yes, the universities do play a very, very important part in this. But again, it comes back to having that dialogue with the companies.
So you both give me very good ideas of things to suggest to policymakers if I get invited to these different conferences. Look, we have 4 minutes left. I'm going to take a big risk here and read what my recommendations were. And from this, I deduce that your brains are a lot bigger than mine because you touched upon a lot of things which I didn't come up with. But the things I was suggesting people do is obviously to start preparing their approach immediately. There's no doubt that it's starting to become a precedent topic. Getting the governance right, that we didn't discuss a lot, but I think there needs to be one clear owner in organizations for this. Otherwise, you end up in situations where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. I also put as a point, don't worry too much about the formalization in the initial stages, but concentrate on improving your understanding. Our discussions have sort of supported this point of view, I think, which is nice. Also, policy is only a starting point. Prototyping, I mentioned, and this came up at the end, with regular improvements based on experience. And the last thing is, we didn't really say it, but I think we were all thinking in a very simple way. In a similar way, is the need to keep it simple. So, we all sort of had these visions of piles of paper and very complex chains of requirements or attestations. So I think we need something that is flexible and agile and will work in the dynamic market. So I've got time for Paul and then Ian, perhaps, to say what you think about any last recommendations to the audience before we leave them.
Well, we've touched on it around sectors. Just don't do these things alone. I would say the more collective conversations that you can have, the better outcomes that you achieve, and the more commonality, it's just good for all.
Okay, Ian.
Just go and produce some documentation. I mean, software bill of materials. Give it to your customer and just start that conversation. They'll trust you a lot more.
Excellent. So we're all pretty much in line. That's really good, and we didn't prepare it beforehand. So that's very nice. So listen, I think we have 1 minute left. So in the 1 minute, I would like to thank you both very much. It was a great conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and who knows, maybe we'll see you back in one of these future videos. Thank you, guys.